computer. Brill. Thanks, Steve. Okay, we're recording now. Hi to everyone who's watching on record. Yeah, the first thing I wanted to talk about was a preprint of a paper that Steve released pretty recently. How recent was this? May 27th. Okay. So what I gather from it is that it's a deep learning program that generates new chemicals using a technique called reinforcement learning, which is the same sort of technique that, for example, chess playing robots programs, AIs use. But you can apply these sorts of things to generating new chemicals for particular properties. Is that right, Steve?
Yes, that's correct. The advantage of this is that many of the things we want to predict can't be formulated in a way that works with a normal neural network because they're not differentiable. So
Okay.
we use this kind of reinforcement learning approach because that sidesteps that issue, because you don't need to have differentiable targets.
Okay, I see. So
does that make sense?
I understand, but then I have a background in this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
actually, I think this paper's quite a hard one for a novice to follow. There's a lot of terminology and a lot of mathematics that might be quite difficult to follow unless you have a background in the subject.
yeah.
But if someone does look at it, what I recommend is they look at some of the other original papers referred to, which go into the method in a bit more detail, and it's a bit easier to understand what's going on.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll post a link to the paper, and you have a GitHub repository. Is that right?
Yes.
With a sort of it's got a bit of a skinny overview on the landing page, which is reads quite nicely. So I'll post that after the end of the meeting. But from what I can understand, it's based on, or it makes a fork of Chemprop. Is that right, Steve?
That's right, yes.
So
we like stealing other people's ideas.
Yeah, well, I guess it's not stealing. No more than us using pandas is stealing. It's fine. It's all open source. So Chemprop was a program that was developed, I think, earlier this year in this paper that was using deep learning to discover new antibiotics. It wasn't generating the chemicals. It was just learning to predict which chemicals are good antibiotics and bad antibiotics. And then they showed it millions and millions of chemicals. And then they found a handful that actually worked and then tested them in the lab, and they still actually worked, which is pretty fantastic. It uses a very specialized architecture of neural network that deals with a pretty tricky problem of putting chemicals in, because they're quite awkwardly shaped, let's say. So what sort of chemicals were you trying to make out of this, Steve?
This one, we just thought of some target problems. Basically, we got some data from BindingDB.
Oh yeah, for a dopamine transporter.
That's right.
Okay, dopamine being the rewarding chemical in your brain, and norepinephrine, is that another word for adrenaline, or
I think it is, yes.
Okay, and it looks like this is the correlation between the actual values and then the values that your model was predicting, and it looks like it correlates quite nicely.
Yes, that's quite
nicely. I wish my models did that.
Yes, that's quite good considering some of the ones I've seen.
Yeah, this is brilliant. Anyway, that's Steve's preprint of a paper. Like I said, I'll post a link to it, the GitHub, and maybe a very brief overview on the Slack channel up here, the MIB Slack channel. Okay. Then before we start our session, is there any admin housekeeping, anything that anyone wants to bring up before we start?
Yes, the link that you put on the Slack channel to the collab, I don't have access to that. I don't know if I'm supposed to. As in, it says access denied.
Access denied.
Yeah, if I just follow it on the GitHub, is that going to be okay?
Yeah, so the GitHub one won't be interactive unless you download the notebook to your computer. But you can do that with...
If I just open it on Jupyter.
Yeah, if you open it with Jupyter, and it should work just fine.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Yeah, to anyone who's in a similar predicament to Dee, then on our GitHub page here, which I think I have a link for, you can download everything here, then unzip it, and then if you launch a Jupyter notebook in that folder, then you should be able to work through all of the notebooks, no problem. Is anyone else having the same problem as Dee regarding not being able to access this notebook?
I've got the same, but I'll go into it now with.
No, I guess then probably everyone has the same problem. Only people added. Oh, okay. Anyone with the link can view. Okay. All right. Try opening the link now, and then if it doesn't work, then I'll paste a new link in. So what I was thinking with today's session, given that there's more of us who are new to Python here, and also that we have sort of skipped past quite a lot of basics, I thought I'd spend the next couple of sessions sort of revisiting some of the basics that we've missed. And also working in some potentially, more powerful underlying or some more powerful simple operations. So it builds on top of some of the fundamentals that we covered in this notebook, the Basic Bits Python one, which is a link that should take you to the GitHub copy of it. I have contents here, but the contents was sort of me noting it down and then forgetting about what I was noting down at the beginning. So in future tutorials, I'll build in this notebook and actually address some of these items. But for today, we'll mostly focus on tricks with strings and lists. I also make a fair amount of reference to this book called Python Notes for Professionals, which I recommend quite highly. I've got a link to it in our resources section of UOM Python Club. It's a free ebook, this one here, Python Notes for Professionals. You can download it here. It covers loads and loads and loads. Don't be intimidated by it being called for professionals. It's just a good reference text. So yeah, it's got all sorts in a nice amount of detail. Like for example, say we want to look at lists like we do today. The format is sort of like this, so it's quite easy to digest and dip in and out. You don't have to work your way through it section by section. You can just find whatever you're looking for. And all of the, most of the answers in here are taken from Stack Overflow, which is a website online that if you Google any Python error that you have, then Stack Overflow is likely to be one of the first web forums that comes up. It's a lifesaver, I think, is probably an understatement. So most of the code is taken from various answers to, people's pressing questions that have been posted and answered on Stack Overflow. So very highly recommend that you check out and download this free ebook here. Okay, so without much further ado, let's get to the tutorial. So everyone now hopefully can open the Colab notebook. Is there anyone who is not able to do that? Okay. Okay then. So in the basic bits Python notebook that we covered a couple of weeks ago, the final exercise was to build a DNA translator that translates some DNA into a protein, and it's used dictionaries. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the actual science behind some of this independently of the code itself, because now that Python Club is expanding a little bit, it's not, we're not all scientists. So I'll give a bit of background. So this is the sequence that we ended up translating from our DNA. Each letter represents one possible amino acid. Amino acids are chemicals which have this sort of backbone, and out of the side on this what represents a carbon here, you can have various different side chains that have various chemical properties. Another important thing to know about amino acids is that you can chain them together end to end, which is how proteins are made. So the NH2 group joins to the OH group over here, and that's how they're chained together. So then you end up with a chain of building blocks, each of which have different chemical properties and geometric properties. So like, for example, some of them have fairly long, flexible side chains. Some of them have rings. Some of them have charges, and so on. All of which gives you a chain with specific properties that, in our case, folds around a molecule called heme, which is a red molecule found in blood, i.e. hemoglobin. It's centered around an ion here, and when the enzyme in question here is called BM3, when that folds around the heme, it becomes chemically active, and this heme part is sort of the business end of the enzyme. It oxidizes fats that find their way through the tunnel into the middle of the enzyme or the protein. I should note that enzyme is a word for a protein that does chemistry, pretty much. So you can think of it as a sort of a controlled burn reaction, because it's an oxidation reaction. So think of it as a controlled burn that happens in the center of this enzyme to any fats that manage to find their way into this tunnel. The fats that find their way into the tunnel are dependent on the shape of the tunnel and the various chemical properties of all of the amino acids that line it. Luckily for some proteins, we can get their structure using a technique called X-ray crystallography, which is a pretty clever technique that involves a lot of hard work, having worked with a lot of crystallographers. So here's some links and information to the enzyme. Its class is cytochrome P450. This particular one is from bacteria, but humans also have them, particularly in their liver, for metabolizing toxins, drugs, stuff like that. And here's a review written by my boss, which will give you the lowdown on BM3. So here's a picture of the structure of BM3 here. You can sort of see the heme group in the center there. These coils are sort of a simplification of the chemical structure. It will be a little bit too much to view if you had every single atom in there. So whenever these amino acid chains sort of form a spiral-like pattern, they're just represented as coils here. If you follow this link, it should take you to an interactive viewer in the protein data bank. There's a 3D visualization button here. The protein data bank contains all of the known structures of proteins, or almost all of them. So feel free to browse through. You can pan, zoom, and so on. And you can see the heme in the middle, and is the tunnel's a little bit, well, we're looking from the tunnel into the center now, but that's where fats would go in. All of these red dots are water molecules, and there's a few other sort of straggling molecules here and there. So that's a brief overview of our protein. And the reason I bring them up is because it's one of the things that we do in the Manchester Institute of Biotechnology, especially my research with my group. We work on engineering these things to do different sorts of chemistry with different sorts of molecules, which is useful for agriculture in the case of my project, drug development, and making chemical processes more environmentally friendly, because you don't really need harsh chemicals if you can do chemistry with these things. And it all happens at room temperature and so on, just like it would in a bacteria living in soil, for example. Okay, so that's an overview of the protein and the data that we're dealing with today. And we're going to look at string parsing today. So this is a problem that I've come into more than once. So the use case in this might be that we find, say, a table on a website that we want to copy and paste into our script or into our notebook or whatever. And then we want to extract the useful values from it. But to turn a copy and pasted table into a useful table sometimes takes a couple of tricks. Not difficult tricks, but tricks that are worth knowing. So the aim of this tutorial is to take this table of properties of the different amino acids, the ones listed up here. See, each one corresponds to a letter, which is in some cases short for its name. Sometimes they're just assigned whatever letters are left over. So each one of these letters in the rows are the name of the amino acids, and then the properties are listed along the top. Molecular weight, log P, which is a property that refers to how oily it is, pretty much how much it likes water, let's say. Hydrogen bond donors and acceptors, the number of aromatic rings. An aromatic ring is a ring that's sort of listed with these double bonds here. The number of rotatable bonds and a few other properties. So in our case, we will be copying and pasting it as we would from a website. So let me clear this cell. So if I were to copy and paste it straight in, it looks neat enough, but that won't do. It doesn't really get interpreted very well by the interpreter. And also we need to set it as a variable so that we can actually work with it. So a pretty convenient way to have a string that spans multiple lines is to wrap it in triple quotes rather than single quotes. It's worth noting that this is also a nice way to do multi-line comments, but you can set this string as equal to a variable. I'm going to call it data. And then if I run data again at the bottom of the cell, then it should print at the bottom whatever data is equal to. So you'll notice that there's a lot of \t and \n in this table. That's nothing to worry about. That's an artifact of how these things are actually encoded. So if I actually run print data on the data, what happens is the Python interpreter interprets the \t as a tab and \n as a new line. That's fairly standard notation for new lines and tabs in your text. So if you were to look under the hood of what's going on in a website, you might see that there are \n's and \t's to represent these characters. So that's a neat version. You might notice that some of these values have sort of slipped over because it doesn't actually know that it's a table yet. But I'm going to keep the version that has the \t's and the \n's in, because we're going to need to get rid of them and process them to make it into a coherent table. Yeah, here we go. So / is usually an escape character, and the character that follows the / gets special treatment. So in our case, we have \t and \n for tab and new line, but there are others. You can find them more through this Wikipedia link here. So the very simplest way to turn what we have up here, this string, into a table that we can actually use is to use the IO module in conjunction with pandas. Pandas we've covered before. Is one of our core tools for working with table-based data. And we can use it to read files like read Excel files or read CSV files, which is a format of a table saved as text data. CSV stands for comma separated values. So if you were to look at a CSV file under the hood, it would just be each value in the table with a comma in between, and then a new line for a new line. But one way to easily turn our string into a data frame is to call this io.string io data on it and pass that to the pandas CSV constructor. So io.string io means that the string io function belongs to this IO module. So think of it as a file within the folder of IO, if you like. If you run a question mark after string IO, then you immediately get a help button up here. IO contains a lot more functions for solving problems similar to this. And it returns a sort of file-like object that we can then pass to a standard pandas read CSV function, which is what we do here. But then you'll notice that I put delimiter equals \t. Can anyone tell me why I've put delimiter equals \t in here? So the reason why I've done that is because read CSV normally expects a comma as the delimiter, the character that separates the values. But in this case, it's not true. The tab, the \t, is what separates each value in a row. So I've specified explicitly that delimiter equals \t. So that's why I've done that there. So that's a handy trick for when you are dealing with string data that you'd really like to be read as a file. But the focus of this tutorial today is going to be more on string tricks. Sorry about that. I keep on double clicking on my text boxes, which makes them show all the stuff under the hood. Okay, so let's dive into some exercises. Before we do the exercises, I suppose I should introduce you to the split function, which I have listed out down here. And I'll also tell you the aim. So the aim of the exercises is to take the string that we saved as data in the cell up here, and if you haven't run that cell already, then then run it, so that in your instance of Colab, then there will be a variable called data that will be equal to this string. So the aim is to make a dictionary object, which is an object that we covered in the Basic Bits Python tutorial. But if you haven't seen it, then essentially it's a collection of items which each has a specific key or lookup value, which means that you can easily extract the data that you want just by feeding it a value. So in our case, we might have a key of H bond donors. If we want to find the number of H bond donors for a particular amino acid, then we can look up values that correspond to that. So we want to get a dictionary of our data. And ultimately, we want to use this dictionary to calculate properties about our protein. So one of the first things that we'll need to do is to split this string data into rows, and then split those rows into each individual value. And for that, we'll be using the split function, like I mentioned earlier. The other steps that we'll be taking later on then are to construct the dictionary that looks a little bit like this, like I mentioned earlier. So for example, this dictionary will correspond to the amino acid A for alanine, and then contains all of its properties. And then later on, we'll be wanting to make a dictionary of dictionaries so that we can easily apply that to find properties for the whole sequence of our protein. So let's talk about split. Split is a method that's built into Python, so you won't need to import anything. And it splits strings into a list based on a character that you want to split on. So for example, in this section, I've built a string that is a paste of this line, and I split it on any spaces. So I've just fed it the string for a space. It's essential that you wrap any character that you want it to split on with these quote marks. It's worth noting that splitting on the space is the default behavior. So if you don't give it any parameters or arguments, then it will behave the same way. But I wanted to put that in to illustrate that that's how you would split it if you wanted to split it on, say, a comma or a full stop or whatever. So the output of calling split on this string is a list where each item is sort of split on every space, and we have a list of these, which is pretty handy. Yeah, another thing worth noting is that unlike some functions where you write the function before the input, notice how this function sort of comes out of the string. You have the string object here highlighted, and then dot split comes out of it. That's because the string class of object has a built-in function called split. So the string object's function split will get called. So think of it like this split function belongs to this string, and well, I guess it belongs to all strings. Okay, and we'll also be touching on for loops, which if you haven't covered them, then I recommend checking out our tutorial on list comprehensions, which talks about for loops briefly, and then also a way to compress a for loop into a single line of code, which is probably one of the most useful tricks that I know. And there's a whole chapter on it in Python Notes for Professionals in chapter 21. So one aspect of the exercises here will be to fill lists using these for loops, and also fill dictionaries. So say we want to loop through these two lists of letters and numbers, and then we want to add each one to a second list or a dictionary, or perform some operations, or whatever we want to do. Here I've built a simple for loop that, unlike some for loops, it uses the zip function, another built-in Python function that takes in 2 or more iterables. iterables, for example, like lists. All that does is it lets you loop through 2, 3, 4 things at once rather than just one thing, which is pretty handy here. So in the first iteration, I and j will be equal to A and 1, and then B and 2, and C and 3, and so on. So we loop through the letters and numbers at the same time. And I will be the letter, j the number. To add an item to a list, the list has to already exist first. So notice that we've constructed these lists outside of the for loop. Otherwise, if we were to construct them inside the for loop, they will just get reconstructed in from scratch in every iteration, which will pretty much wipe it clean if it's already got something in. So the list's name and dot append, and then in brackets, the item that you want to append to that list. To add stuff to dictionaries, the syntax is a little bit different. It's similar to how you would access values with the square brackets, only that we give it a key that might not exist in the dictionary already. So our dictionary, before you run this, doesn't contain any keys. But now we specify under dictionary key I, which in the first iteration will be A, that will be equal to j. We set that equal to j, which in the first iteration will be number 1. And then in number 2, it will add the key number B and number 2, and so on. So that's a brief introduction of some of the syntax that you may need to use in these exercises. Okay, exercise number 1. So given that we can split a string and that we have this item data, your task is to split the data into a list of rows. I'll start a short timer for maybe 5 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. And then I'll start doing the exercise and talking you through it. Timer 4 minutes, cool. Okay, off you go. Is anyone having trouble with splitting the data into a list of rows?
How do I know that it came out as a list?
Good question. So one way is that if you print it, then it should be in the format of items within square brackets separated by commas. Another way to find out is to enter type and then the item that you want to find the type of within those brackets. So for example, that returns list because A, B, C, D, E is a list. Does that help?
Yes, it was a list.
Brill, cool.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I see my result is just one row, but with the square break. But so I don't know it because I see on the practice it's asking for list of rows. So I'm thinking it's like it's maybe more or less like a multiple rows. But what I see on my screen is just one row. Is that correct?
Do you mind pasting your answer into the chat and I'll have a look.
Okay, I'm doing it on another computer. Okay, but I will try to do this.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the structure of heme is similar to that of chlorophyll, the green from plants. It's called a porphyrin. So in the synthesis pathway within the cells, they sort of have a similar process up until a point, and then they sort of diverge and branch off. Okay. Oh, I didn't even get to use the countdown clock. Okay. All right. Well, I'll go through one possible way of doing it. So similar to before, how we called split on our string earlier, we want to split data on the character \t. Oh no, sorry, \n, which is the new line character. So with no arguments, it's just split it into every possible letter. So what I told you earlier about splitting on white space might not have been accurate. We'll see. Okay, that's \split n. So these are the rows. So see how in the first row we just have the names of the columns with \t in between each item. And we also have then the data entries with the amino acid letter, each one here. So I'm gonna set a variable called rows is equal to data split.n. So that should come out the same as before. Now, if I want to split each item in rows into another list, then I'm going to have to use a for loop. So there are two ways of doing this. I'll start by using a sort of a classic for loop. I'll set an empty list to the variable name that I want my table to be. So I'm going to call it table. And it's not much now, but after this loop, it should be full of a list of lists of all the individual values. Okay, so I'll start my for loop now. For I in rows. It's not important what letter or what you call each item in your rows, so long as it's a valid variable name. It will get updated each time. So let's print I in each row actually, which won't do anything particularly functional for us, but it'll just let us see what I is each time. Okay, so what it's done here is let me space them out so we can see, differentiate between them a little easier. So this is the first row. it has rendered the tabs in between each letter, so we can't see those, but make no mistake, they are in there. So let's try splitting each row. So I will be each row in each case, and we'll run split. And now we want to split it on the tabs, which separate each value in each row. See what that looks like. Okay, so that lists out each item in each row. Okay, so the only thing to do now is to add that to our empty list table. We'll remember from earlier that we can use table.append. So we'll do that, table.append. Autocomplete, like you saw there, is a pretty useful function. And let's print table at the bottom to see what it looks like. And here we go. So now we have a list of all of the column headers, including this empty string up here. And then we have all of the rows down here. Okay, so that's table. Okay, next exercise. Okay, exercise 3. Extract the top row, and that's the column headers of your table using list slicing. So if you're already familiar with list slicing, then feel free to get started with the exercise. List slicing is the name for extracting values from a list. Honestly, I'm not sure why it's called slicing, but essentially you'll say which number of that corresponds to the item in the list that you want, or maybe a range of items, and you can get those back. In chapter 64 in Python Notes for Professionals, there's a very nice description of it, so I recommend you check that out if you'd like to find out more. And here I've listed some simple examples of the syntax. So up here we create a list. Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay, so we create a list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10. And the syntax for getting slices or chunks of a list is fairly flexible, but it can include up to the item that you want to start and stop at, and the step size. So that's for in the case that you want to collect a range of values between A and B, and you want it to skip, say, every other one, then you might want to employ all 3 of these parameters. But in the simplest case, you can just say, find me the 0th item in the list. It's 0 because Python, like a lot of other computer languages, starts counting at 0 because why waste a whole number? It's a little bit more efficient on the computer that way. So the 0th item in this list L is 1, so we get 1 out. To find the last item, you can use -1, which is handy because then you don't need to know how long the list is. To get items 0 to 4, or a range of items, then you put a colon between your start and your stop item. You'll notice that until this point, I haven't actually put the step size in, and that's because if you don't put it in, it's just assumed to be 1, which is pretty convenient. So list items 0 to 4 returns me 1, 2, 3, 4. You should note that this corresponds to their position in the list, not the actual values in the list. The list could just as easily be filled with letters, and L 0 to 4 would return letters A to D. To get 4 onwards, then you would, in your index, put the starting index 4, and then a colon, and then leave the stop parameter blank, and it will just assume that you mean up until the end of the list, and will return you exactly that. And also leaving the step size blank, it will assume that you want a step size of 1, and that's exactly what we get here. To get every other number between 2 and 8, then finally we do actually specify a step size. So we want it to start at the second item in the list, index number 1, as opposed to 0. and we want it to finish at index number 8, which luckily in this case happens to be the actual number 8. And we give it a step size of 2, which means that it skips every other item. So that's a brief intro to list slicing. And the exercise is to extract the top row of this variable, which in my case I've saved as table, but you might have saved it as something else. Extract the top row using list slicing. And in my case, I'm going to save it as something like header, because that's how I'm going to refer to it later on. So yeah, the exercise is use list slicing to isolate this. I'll start a counter again. I think I'll give us less than 4 minutes because this is a fairly straightforward one. Is anyone having any trouble with this exercise? Okay. Well, in that case, the answer was table square bracket 0. That returns you the first item, which in our case corresponds to the headers. And I'm going to save that as variable name header. Here we go. Okay, next exercise. A little bit more difficult. It requires some list indexing and a for loop. So we want the row names from table. So let's have a little look at table to remind ourselves what we're dealing with. So we want the A, the C, the D, and so on for each item in table, not including this blank string here. Start another timer for that one. Okay, off you go.
Do we need to create a data frame for this? Because otherwise I don't know how to iterate through.
Good question. No, we're just going to focus on lists and built-in Python stuff today.
Okay.
Ying, did you manage to solve your list issue from earlier where you had a list with only one item in?
Yes, I see the problem already. Thank you.
Real. Okay, cool. Is anyone having any trouble with this exercise? Okay.
Not particularly with the exercise, but if you know, when you do a for loop inside the brackets, does that mean that I don't need to have another separate list on the side? Because I started with a normal for loop, and now I want to change it into the one inside the brackets. But I don't know if I should take away the list that I've done before.
Can you paste what you're trying to do in the chat so I can have a little look? Okay. I see. So
should I just get rid of the index list?
Yeah, there's no need to run append in the comprehension either because it returns a list anyway. I'll cover both ways of doing it when I go through the answer. Speaking of which, okay. So one way that we could have done that is by starting to iterate through table from list index 1 onwards. So I've printed the whole table here using a comment to ignore the slicing index. So we want everything except this. So we want to be looping through these lists here, and we want the first item of each of these lists. So we're going to start our loop with table 1 onwards, index 1 onwards. So we're going to go for I in table 1 onwards. And we're also going to construct a list to catch all of these letters. So I'm going to call that index or amino acids. That's an empty list. So in each of these loops, I will become this list, and this list, and so on. And we want the first item in that. So let's create a temporary variable called AA is equal to I0, the first item in the list. And let's print that to have a little look. Okay, so these are the items that we want to be catching. The only thing to do now is to append them to this empty list up here. So we can do that with amino acids dot append. And there we go. Now we have all of our amino acids in a single list. Option number 2 for doing that was to use a list comprehension, which is, like I mentioned earlier, a for loop that is exactly equivalent to this, except in a single line of code. If you're new to Python, it's a useful technique, but it's not an essential technique. It's just something that makes your code a little bit shorter, which is good if you're lazy like me. But if it's difficult to understand, then check out the resources that I've left up here that refer to list comprehensions. So we want to be looping through table. So similar to before, we have a variable I for each item in table from 1 onwards. And if we were to run that, then that's the list of lists of all of the values. Now the only thing to do is to catch the 0th item in each list. And there we go. So in a single line of code, we've done exactly this. So that's the other way of doing it. I suppose I don't need to set that as equal to a variable because I've already caught them with this variable amino acids up here. Okay. Extracting table entries. Okay, so this is the last indexing exercise. Now we want to catch everything that's not an index or a column header. So let's take another look at table. So we want all of the numbers basically, and then maybe save that as a variable called, what did I save it as? Values or something like that. Call it what you like. Okay. Your time starts now. It's worth noting that your answer may be very similar to this answer.
You better use that countdown clock this time.
Yeah, I keep forgetting. All right, you have my word. Is anybody having trouble with this exercise? Can you guys hear that?
We're allowed to phone a friend.
You can't phone a friend and count down. Can you? Maybe I don't watch enough Countdown. Yeah, how did everyone get on with that? Okay. Okay, so let's take the code that we used in our previous answer as a template. Actually, no, that's cheating. Let's start from scratch. So similar to before, I'll make an empty list called values, and I will also be wanting to loop through table items 1 onwards, because table item 0 is the headers, not the actual values. So I want to skip past that. And then the values are I. So remember how in the last section, for each row, you know what, instead of I, I'm going to say row. For each row in table, I want items 1 onwards as opposed to 0. 1 onwards. That's got to be in square brackets. Let's print that to see what it looks like. There we go, that's what we want. So then we'll be appending that to values. But you know what I've done? Avoid doing this. Avoid reusing variable names for different stuff, because that means that when I try and append this to that, I've overwritten the original list because I've used the same name again. I'm going to call this one nums. Yeah, I'm not a top speller. Anyway, then to append that to the list values, dot append nums. And let's have a look at values, see what that looks like. Okay, that looks okay. But there's an issue. Notice how all of these numbers are wrapped in quote marks. That means that they won't be treated as numbers when it comes to actually doing maths with them later. So we've got to do another step to make sure that they actually are treated like numbers. And a simple way to do that is to call either int or float on the string. See here how when we try and do maths with a string and a normal number, in this case 5, an integer, we get a type error. Type error is to do with what type of object you're trying to do this operation with. In this case, the string type of object and the integer type of object are trying to be added together, but they can't, they're not compatible. So our options are to either call float, which is short for floating point number, which means any number with a decimal point. We can call that on this, and it will immediately process the string into a floating point number if it's applicable. If your string has letters in, then you won't be as lucky. And then we can add it to something like 5, which is exactly what happens here. So yeah, similar to before, we want to turn each one of these values into a floating point number. And I say floating point number because although some of them are integers, it'll be simpler to call float on every item in this table rather than int on some of them. If you were to call int for integer on a floating point number, then it would immediately just round it to a whole number, which isn't accurate. So for example, some of these 0.4 here, see what that does if we call int on it. Well, it fails. There we go. Okay. So I was...
Take the quotes out.
Yeah, it's true. So the exercise now is to, there you go, it rounds it down. Turn each item in this table values into a floating point number where applicable. Well, all of them actually. I'm aware that I've gone a little bit over time, so I'll try and start to wrap this one up a little bit quicker. I'll give us, oh, thanks timer. I'll give us 2 minutes and then run through the answer after. Is that okay? Cool. So in this case, I'll be operating on values, which is what I've called my table of results.
Do we need to do a for loop inside a for loop?
Yes. Well, if you can think of a way to avoid doing that, then yeah, go ahead. I'll be interested to see the answer, actually. I'm sure there's multiple ways of doing it. They usually are.
Can you turn that into a for loop inside a list? Do I need to?
You can if you want. Yeah, extra points if you can turn it into a list.
Okay.
Browser ruined it. Okay. How did everyone get on? Okay, so
Need a bit more time.
Sorry?
Nothing, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so similar to before, I'll make another list to catch everything that comes out of my loop. And our answer will be very similar to the one before, only there'll be another loop of that within the first for loop. So I'm going to call my new table values floats, something like that, is equal to an empty list. Okay, and values is, we'll remember, is the original table that contains the strings. Okay, so we loop through each row in values, and then within that for loop, we have another one that loops through each item in the row. So let's print item. Here we go. Each one of them is a string. We can find out by calling the type on the item, and it says type string. Okay, cool. So we want to call the operation float on each one of these items, which then returns the floating point number, which then allows us to do maths. For example, I can do that for every item in the list without it causing an error. So that's good. Okay, so I'll save that as a variable here. But if I were to straight away add that to this list, then I would get a flat list, which isn't what I'm after. So let's run that and see what values floats turns out as. Yeah, there we go. So I've lost all of my table structure. It's no longer a list of lists. It's just one big long list. So the way I'm going to get around that is within this for loop, just like before, I'm going to make a sort of a temporary list. I'm going to call that temp. And then I will append my floating point numbers to temp. And then let's print temp in each case to see what that looks like. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that I want to be appending to values floats up here. And I want to be doing it after the second for loop, but still within the first. So we go values floats dot append, and there we go. Okay, given that we've overrun, I'm wondering how much time I should put into it, or we should all put into it. If you would like to come back to the rest of this in the next tutorial, then feel free. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go through it now and then it'll be recorded, and if you run out of time on your lunch break or whatever, then yeah, just check the recording later. I'll make sure that it's sent around. Okay, this next exercise is a little more difficult. So now we're going to create a dictionary for each amino acid. So we'll start by making one just for the amino acid alanine. Have I left enough information for you to do this? I think I might have skipped that. There's almost enough. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll get started with this exercise and then let you guys finish it. So I'm going to create an empty dictionary. Dictionary is denoted by these curly brackets here. And then remember how before to add something to the dictionary, you would do it like that. So you give it the index, an index that doesn't currently exist or one that you want to overwrite, and then you give it the new value for each one. So in this case, we want to have a dictionary of the values of each row and the values of, remember the variable that, at least the value that I've saved as header contains all of these items. Sorry, the what I want to be the dictionary keys. Okay, so yeah, the aim of the dictionary, the aim of this exercise is to make a dictionary that contains the keys that correspond to the column headers that we extracted earlier, and the values that correspond to the properties in our first row, which corresponds to A for alanine. Yeah, again, because we're running out of time, I'll give us a 2 minute one on that. Does anyone have any questions about this exercise?
Yeah, how do you
Okay.
iterate certain numbers in a range? I forgot how to do it. As in for blah in 0 to, yeah.
Something like that?
Oh, okay, it's with parentheses. Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks.
Cool. Yeah, I'll be interested to see how your answer goes. So I think the way when I was planning it, at least the way I was doing it, I don't think I used range. But for those of us who haven't seen range before, range finds us the range of numbers between, say, 0 and 10. It takes similar notation to the slicing that we saw earlier, where you give it a start, a stop, and a step size, and then it will, similar to how we saw earlier, list numbers all the way up to, but not including, the stop, each separated by the step size. If you don't specify the step size, then it will assume it's 1. The difference here is that they're separated by commas, not colons. And if you only put in one value, then it will assume that the start is 0 and the end is or the stop value is the value here. But anyway, that's range values. Okay. So how would I do this one? So we're trying to make a dictionary that combines header and also, what do I call this one? Values floats. The 0th item in that So there's a couple ways you can do this actually. We can use loops like we did before. Another way of doing it is with either comprehensions, for those of us who know about comprehensions. So a comprehension, in the case of list comprehensions, is a for loop that returns a list within a list. So that's the one-line for loop that I was talking about earlier. You can do the same thing with dictionaries. So in this case, yeah, we'll see my labels are misaligned, but you get the idea. I suppose I should have gone from header 1 onwards. But then I miss out molecular weight. Oh no, I don't. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to call the dictionary constructor, which also takes a zip argument. We'll remember that a zip is a way to sort of iterate through two things at once. So the two things that we want to iterate are the header item and the values floats, the first row, and that also works. But of course I want 1 onwards. So the issue here is that my header object contains this empty string at the beginning. So there's one extra item in that compared to the values in my calculated table. So there you go. There's one other way of doing that. And then the way to do it with a for loop is to create an empty dictionary and then for I, j, or let's say name value. And so I'll be looping through the property names and the property values in header 1 onwards, because remember the first item is pretty useless to me, and values floats 0. And then within the loop, I will say that the dictionary value name is equal to val. And then if I print the dictionary down here, so the error here is because I forgot to put an equals in. And here we go, I get a similar answer. Cool. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll leave the last couple of exercises as homework. Also, my laptop's running out of batteries, so I need to address that soon. So an overview of the next two exercises were similar to here: create a dictionary of dictionaries where each item in the topmost dictionary, the keys are each of the amino acids letters, A, C, and so on. And within that, it stores the molecular weight, the log P, and all of the other properties for it. And then after that, the next two exercises are, number 1, find the number of aromatic rings in the amino acid tryptophan, which is a W. So there's a couple ways that you can do that. We'll talk about answers next week. I've left some of the answers in this file here, which if you run this command, it will download it, or if you paste this into your URL bar, it will take you straight to the Python file that it comes from. But by downloading it, then I can import the functions. So if you don't manage to make the dictionary within a dictionary, then run these two cells, and then it will create the variable D that contains the desired outcome. There we go. And then the exercise that follows that is to use that dictionary to find the total molecular weight of the protein that we showed above. So it's been about an hour since I talked about that, but the sequence is in there. I've pasted it in this cell here, and it's also in there above. So you're going to have to do a couple of steps here. One of them is to take out these enter characters in there. There's also a little star at the end, which corresponds to the stop of the protein. That's just some biology notation. Then you will have to loop through each item in this string, or each letter in the string, look up the molecular weight for that amino acid from your dictionary, or if you didn't manage to construct it, then from this dictionary. Add them all together, and then also add the weight of the heme, the other group that is in the protein there, to find the total molecular weight of our protein of interest. Yeah, we'll talk about answers next week, same time. Does anyone have any questions or concerns regarding any of the content that we've gone through today? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you all for coming. If it was your first time at Python Club, welcome. I hope you enjoyed it. In the future, we'll do more projects that maybe span 2 or 3 weeks on a particular topic, and that's how we'll do stuff. And at some point I'll start, I've got 6 minutes left, and at some point I'll start uploading the video somewhere for you all to see. Okay, before I run out of batteries, I will leave, but it was nice to see all of you, and I hope you have a good weekend.
Cheers, James.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for this.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
No, thank you guys for coming.
James. Thanks a lot.
Oh, I missed the chat. Sorry, everybody. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.